Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This session is entitled Recycling, Where Do We Go From Here? And it is being presented by Laura Stevens from UW Milwaukee and myself, Travis Blomberg from the Office of Sustainability at UW Madison. If you'd like to get our info, there it is for you. Again, this session is being recorded, so you'll have a copy of this after we are done.
All right.
You can take it. Yeah. So today's agenda, we're breaking up into 4 parts. Number 1 is why are we here? Second is how did we get here? And 3 is where do we go now? And then we'll have a lot of time to have questions and answers and a bigger discussion at the end.
All right. So why are Travis and I here talking to you today? That's where we're going to start. And also, how did Travis get roped into having this discussion with all of us? So thanks, Travis, for doing this with me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start here. Recycling has been showing up in the media kind of in a negative and misleading way. We're going to talk about why is it showing up more heavily now? What happened? Why did that happen? And where do we go next? You can kind of see that media misinformation is kind of a hot topic in our culture today. I've highlighted some red, some kind of just terms that you might see in other parts of our life right now, especially in the US. So lots of misinformation and overwhelm. This isn't just happening like on an external, in the external realm, it's impacting our campuses too. So I've done a little research on the UWM campus. I have service learning students every semester, and also with Kate and John, we've worked in a few classes, and we've been able to collect information on how the public, our campus community, but also student perception is on recycling. And I'm sure most of you've heard these before. So a lot of these are either quotes or just like generalizations that people have made using those like keywords like inconvenient and things like that. So part of this discussion is kind of weaving in how did we get to these perceptions today. All right. So now we'll go into a little not so history lesson of how we got that perception around recycling, especially kind of in a negative way. So I want to start off with Travis and I are not historians, so please don't go too hard on us when it comes to our timelines here. These are just very generalizations. And it's less so on like a historical timeline and more looking at like cultural patterns that produced over a certain amount of time. So I'll start with this slide. And you can see our liner of most of history. Nothing is waste until it's wasted. So for the bulk of our history, you did not waste items. You ate all your food, you used the whole animal, everything got composted. Clothing were made out of things that eventually would compost back into natural form. You could smelt metal and all that kind of stuff. And then you see kind of in the 1860s, after like the first polymers were invented, those were still heavily used in like the manufacturing field. But that is a crucial point because it was kind of one of the first points in history where we no longer had to really focus on waiting on nature to produce a product so we could produce something. So, we no longer had to wait for a plant to weave clothing anymore. We could now use linens or use polymers to make other things. So I'll go to the next slide to explain the rest kind of key points in history. So we really see some big dramatic changes around World War II. Plastic was heavily developed. It was still mainly used on the manufacturing side. It wasn't so much used in the public phase. But at the same time, during World War II, you're seeing people really heavily use it up, wear it out, or make do without mentality of the use everything. And it's kind of your civic duty to recycle in a way, because it helps support the war effort. But then after World War II, Americans were ready to spend. People are moving back to the suburbs or starting our suburbs. And the plastic industry was ready to provide. I'm going to advance the slide and then I'm going to come back. There is a video here. Some of you might be familiar with it. And they just walk away and leave their trash on the ground. So you can see there was like this really quick switch in a very short amount of time, within like 10 years, where the perception went to you would never do that kind of thing. You would make sure that that material was recycled or reused, never wasted. But then how quickly the perception switched to that's not my responsibility anymore. I get to throw my stuff wherever there is. And there's just really this cultural switch in mindset of who does the recycling and whose responsibility it is for waste. And then fast forward a little bit to the Keep America Beautiful. This is another crucial time in recycling history and with culture around recycling. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Keep America Beautiful public service announcement of the crying Indian who's standing in like on a roadside, I think, and there's a bunch of garbage all over the place. And what this did is that it put the responsibility of recycling and the pollution problem on the consumer only. In this presentation, we're not going to go too heavily into like producer responsibility versus consumer responsibility. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. But we just want you to know that that's a key point in recycling history of who's responsible for this, for recycling. All right. And then around the 90s, there was the launch of single stream. So on your campus, it's either single stream, no sort. What that means is everything goes into one bin. For the positives of that was for the user, it was a lot easier to just tell people if it's recyclable, it goes in this bin. But on the other hand, for the haulers, it was a positive because it saved them on transportation. They no longer had to go out and send multiple trucks. Everything just went into one. The issue that it created, many of you might be familiar with wish cycling. Everybody treats the recycling bin as like a secondary garbage, or they think, going back to the quote bubbles early in the presentation, of it all gets sorted out later, so I can just throw it in one bin. So that creates a really big contamination problem, which feeds into the next part, the national sword. So this is really where the media in 2018 through today, you start seeing this negativity around recycling, like recycling dead, recycling doesn't work. Part of that came from the national sword. So what that was China's policy to ban importation of solid waste and low quality recyclables, to cut down on the amount of foreign waste that was going to them. So typically, before that, America's policy for recycling was basically ship all of it overseas, put all your eggs in one basket. And then what happened is you kind of saw the bubble pop with the national sword. But something that's really important to take away from this is that, China gets the blame for everything. It is not China's fault. That is our waste. And we just need to find better methods for managing it. I know that was a really quick history lesson, but we really want to make sure we have a big discussion. Travis and I are really focusing on how to weave why the cultural piece of recycling and how it's changed over time impacts the economics and how those two end up impacting us on campus. So pass it over to you, Travis.
Yeah, so as you all know, we've always been told why, the reason we recycle is because we have so many benefits. And the benefits are conserving natural resources, it strengthens our economy, and it creates jobs. And for those who want a definition of what we talk about recycling, it's typically, recovering materials, paper, glass, plastic, metals, construction, demo. Um, so we have a general definition of when we say the words recycling, this is what we mean. So that has been traditionally what we've been told. And by and large, so Laura, you can go to the next slide. This is a EPA study that was done in 2016, and it shows you those three things. It's looking at the wages that are created, the employment, and the taxes that are generated through this ecosystem of recycling. That it is a service that's being provided, and it's an economic industry that has advantages to it, and that's what they like to focus on. And the recycling industry does that. So it is adding a ton of jobs. So for every for every X amount of tons of material that's recycled, you're creating jobs along that pathway. So you can go to the next one, Laura. And we reached out to a lot of our industry representatives and material recovery facility operators and asked them this question, as along many others. But the first question that we asked them is recycling dead? And every single one of them gave the same answer. They said, no, it is not dead, but it is changing. And from the national sword policy that came down, it pushed it all back through the supply chain down to the user. So the person who's manufacturing a product has two choices. They can use a virgin material or they can use a recycled material. So the only way they're going to use a recycled material is that if it's a clean source and that if it's a better alternative to the other. That's typically what you have. Or if, again, something I missed in this presentation that I didn't put together is what is the demand for the recycled material product? So if there is a demand for having for a product that is made from recycled material, that's where it starts, is the demand of that product. And then it gets pushed down to the manufacturer. It says, I'm going to make this product. And then it goes down to, okay, where do I source that material from? And it goes again through that whole chain, and I'll show you that later. But what happened was, because of that policy of what so much contaminated material was coming through, our lax requirements that we've gotten used to, just throwing everything in one single stream recycling bin, has led to a lot of problems. So now we have higher requirements for higher end quality, which is now, in order for the material recovery facility to get that higher quality, they need to increase their costs. So whether it's mechanical costs, whether it's human labor, what have you, in order for them to meet that, they need to increase their costs. So the other part that's happening is their cost matrix is changing. And what they're doing is they're adding higher tip fees. And the reason they're doing that, it's going to cover the processing costs and with the decreased value of that sort of material. So that's kind of what the industry is dealing with right now. So Laura, you can go next. Here's a quick example to kind of show what's going on there. And Laura, if you kind of move your cursor away from that a little bit, it might go away. So as Laura was talking about pre-2018, the row above shows you what each of those costs were. So the household cost was artificially low to foster like adoption of recycling. The cost due to the inbound material being cleaner and heavier, you had that. So it was $60 per ton. And this, when I say these costs, these are costs for the waste hauling, like a waste hauling company. So as you can see, really what happens is you look at the two comparison, you look at the net, it is now costing like I said in the other slide, it is costing that waste company to recycle because of the contamination and because the low value of materials. That's really what it gets down to, because they have to increase the higher costs of labor and technology. So, I mean, that's really what everyone has been focusing on, the problem, and it is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. And we'll kind of talk about what we can do as a university and what we are supplying to our material recovery facilities. So, Laura, you go. So I just looked at this from a university's perspective. And since we're in Wisconsin, I took a 1 gallon milk jug and just put some numbers to this. I didn't put together a whole operation plan or profit and loss statement or what have you, but just to put some numbers into context here and saying, you buy a product, let's say it's a gallon of milk, and that's going to $3.51, and then I'm going to discard that. I'm going to put it in a bin. Now, this is where the university gets involved too, if we're talking about bins on campus. Well, number one, that asset is the bin costs money to even have. And if you do have liners in that bucket or in that bin, that's 7 cents every time for every single liner. So that adds up over time when you're dealing with a large campus. Next, you have to add labor to service that bin. So whether it's $15 an hour, and even that tub that you're moving around is $623 as an asset. Then we put that material in a bin, and those typically range anywhere from plus $1,000 for that asset. And again, at the University of Madison, we own all of our containers. Most other universities may be all embedded into the actual waste hauling companies, but either way, someone has to pay for this either way. So next, you actually have to have someone to come out and service that. So that's, let's say anywhere from $20 an hour to actually service that material. And then when you're talking about an asset that is very expensive, that truck is very expensive, and servicing that truck and supplying the fuel for that truck is extremely expensive. So then the material then adds up at a material recovery facility. And depending on how well you did, you will either get a rebate or it will cost you, depending on what you gave your vendor. So Laura, you can go to the next one. And what's important to note here is this is where we need to start. We need to start with the contract terms in which we are giving this material to our vendor. And we need to be more understanding of, when you say contamination, what does that mean? Is it 5% contamination? How is that calculated? And how can I make sure that I am incentivized to give you a clean product? Because it always needs to be incentivized. Otherwise, if we're not incentivized to do it, it's really hard to allocate the resources to do that on a university campus. So Laura, you can go to the next one. So I put this slide in here. When Laura talked about the single stream recycling, there was another phenomenon that was going on as well. So I say big waste, and yep, waste too. So whether it's big oil, big data, there's a consolidation of waste management companies out there. So a lot of you probably already know this. This is not news to you. But when you do that, you have limited competition. So for the top 4 US waste companies out there, they own and control 75% of the permitted landfill capacity. And they also control 50% of the national hauling market. So that's for landfilling and hauling, right? In the 1990s, single stream recycling, in my opinion and other people's opinions, I have a source at the bottom of this page too, that that basically makes the idea that single stream recycling was a way for big waste companies to get more contracts and build up the hauling capacity while still gobbling up the smaller entities so that they control the material stream. So if you have nowhere to go with the material, but one company, then you're you don't have the option of, or even no one has the incentive to actually get the material where it needs to go. So by putting it all in a single stream recycling, yes, if the single stream recycling is clean and non-contaminated, it makes a lot of sense and it works really well. But that's the problem. It's that convenience culture of us just throwing everything in there, and then um, all the while, and then at a certain point in time, they say, "Oh, actually, we have higher standards now." So, it's definitely a manufactured thing that was going on here. And this report that talks about this really goes into how that happened. But regarding recycling, then, big waste companies also own 50% of material recovery facilities out there. So if you don't have a lot of different outlets, you are, hamstrung into what you have. And I think Laura's example will probably illuminate that too. So that's something to consider as we look at universities on whether or not they can actually internalize their hauling practices or if they go to a third-party vendor. So you can go to the next slide, Laura.
All
and
right.
this is perfect example for you.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, Travis, feel free to hop in just based on your experience too. So now we're gonna bring it all back together and give you a campus example of why it does end up impacting campuses. And your campus might have not been impacted yet, and I really hope it doesn't get to the extreme level that UWM had it. But just based on the information that Travis was just talking about, the economics and especially the contamination around there, the trickle down may end up happening to you in your campus. So just giving you an example of UWM and how a market change that we feel as a university kind of just disconnected from, like we're just a university, we have nothing to do with the waste and recycling industry, and how a change in the recycling industry really disrupted our system at UWM. So the main reason why we had to make a change is because of contamination. And Waste Management is our hauler now. They came to us and said, you have to remove all bags from your recycling. So that's not just the grocery bags. They were really focusing on what the custodians use to collect them. We have a lot of buildings and a lot of floors in a lot of those Slim Jim bins to collect recycling. And we don't have a lot of staff. So we went through a long process. I won't get into it, but essentially the most cost-effective and efficient way to make this happen was to hire staff to collect the recycling for UWM and to dump it into a compactor. If we did not do that, we would have faced $265,000 worth in fines. And kind of going back to Travis' conversation about monopolies in waste, another really big issue that UWM faced is we didn't have another cable company to go to. We only had Waste Management. So basically we had to do what they were telling us we had to do. So we had to remove the bags in order to avoid a $265,000 contamination fee from our vendors. So the impact for us is we had to completely overhaul our campus recycling. We had to change everything. We had to hire staff. We had to get equipment. We had to train all of our staff all over again. And we had 6 months to do it. So something off in an industry we don't think that we're a part of really had a huge significant impact for us. So that's kind of like a quick overview. I know we've done other presentations with some of you and at Ishi and things, so we can definitely talk more involved about that later if you'd like. Two things that there were benefits, a lot of benefits to moving over to like internalized hauling, is that it created opportunities for cost avoidance. So that means something as simple as like cardboard. We collect all of our cardboard now and bale it. And right now the market's kind of down for cardboard, so we don't always see the best rebates back on it, but we at least see a cost avoidance through our recycling. As Travis mentioned yesterday or earlier, you either get rebates or you have to pay. We pay to get our recycling hauled off. But with cardboard, for the most part, it kind of just breaks even, which is great. We avoid a cost there. Um, and it also helped us see our stream. We have a daily sample of what our campus is throwing in the recycling, and it is dirty. Like, we totally understand. It really illuminated the issues, and it also really like got us thinking, was our recycling actually being recycled before, because of just how contaminated it was. Right now, our program isn't focusing on pulling out contamination. We just don't have the staff to do that. But we can do kind of like minor things here and there to pull some of that contamination. Right now, we really are focused on just making sure we're keeping those bin liners out of there. And then another huge benefit of what this, just like rethinking our operation, and creating different structures, is it really developed a resilient program for us. The market is not going to stop changing and recycling, especially now that this bubble kind of popped. The market's really figuring out what it's going to do and how it's going to advance. We clearly need a lot more work, especially in the US, when it comes to infrastructure here, to get us through this. So we can only imagine things are going to come and go. And we really need to be able to pivot our programs in a quick amount of time, where it doesn't impact the campus community too much. We want to make sure that our education kind of remains the same over time. So not every 6 months we have to go back to the campus community and say, like, take this out, take that out. We can kind of work on that stuff in the background. And on later part of this presentation, we'll kind of talk about like the upstream approach of don't even bring the material to campus in the first place. So we'll get there. And this also comes back to where Travis was talking about the importance of contract writing. That also helps stabilize your programs for more like resilient programs. For UWM, when we had to go up for a contract amendment, we put in there, if you are going to change anything about your recycling regulations, we need a year. And they agreed to that. So that gives us time if they were to say, we no longer take this. And if you don't stop putting it in your bin, we'll charge you contamination fees. We have a year. So that gives us time to like revamp the program, and do any other educational outreach we might need to do. Do you have any other points, Travis?
No, I think you hit them all.
Awesome.
So yeah, so this is a slide I typically show when I'm doing talks, just to show everybody that, you know, when we think about waste, it's always at the purchasing and disposal of what we physically see. But really, materials and waste is happening throughout the entire supply chain. And that's something that kind of gets often overlooked. So just think about the embodied energy and embodied carbon, and just the embodied waste of your actual material that you then dispose of. So for every 1 ton of purchased material that gets discarded, an estimated 71 tons of material upstream is wasted. So again, just always something to think about in the back of the mind of when we're saying, you know, do we even need that resource in the first place? You know, is something to always, you know, if we can do source reduction, that's where you're going to have the biggest bang for your buck. But also, I like this slide because it shows you like all the steps. So Laura, you can hit the next slide. One thing that I talk to a lot of recycling vendors, and something that keeps getting brought up is the connection between energy and recycling. And it seems like, of course, there's a connection between energy and recycling, but we don't talk about it a lot. And I bring this up because, you know, currently, right now, with the low oil prices that are out there, it is for manufacturers, it is it is cheaper to buy virgin plastic than it is to buy recycled plastic. And for those of you that know, plastics are derived from byproducts of petroleum and refining of natural gas processing. So it begs the question as if you are a manufacturer, why on earth would you ever buy, or why would you ever use recycled content, recycled plastics to make your product if there is not a demand for that? Or if the demand is for whatever product that you're making or whatever the contents of, if it's a beverage container, for example, the people care about the beverage they are consuming, not the actual material that it comes in. And then also, it doesn't just affect plastics, but historically low oil prices, ends up in the past it has strengthened the U.S. dollar. So in turn, then it makes waste paper and metal more expensive to recycle, or it's more expensive than it otherwise would be to use other countries that have the cost of their recycled material would be lower. So that's the perception that I have been seeing more recently. And when I grew up, the reason I was told and understood how recycling worked is that it took out the extraction, the transportation, and the refinery, and it would go right to the processing. So if you cut out all of those things, like it should theoretically be more cost effective. But again, if the cost of energy reflected what it actually should be, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Or if we put a price on carbon, we would not be having this conversation because we would actually just be doing it because it would make complete economic sense to do so. So you can go for the next one, Laura.
All right. So everybody take a deep breath. It's a lot of history and economics in the half hour. So Travis and I could go on and on. So we're
It's
going
funny you
to
say that because when we were practicing, I said we should have just recorded this.
Yeah, we had like a 2-hour session of like, how are we supposed to distill this down? So we're always happy to hop on a call, or I will be. Sorry to speak for you, Travis.
Yeah, that's right.
Or maybe join a new waste working group.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
Got all that extra time not planning a conference.
Yeah, right. So this is where we do have 2 slides that we'll kind of drill down into a little bit more. But this is where we wanted to spend the most of this presentation, is kind of opening up the discussion of where do we go now, especially during COVID and onward. I know for like for UWM, now that we put out the fire of like being able to recycle to begin with, we were really hoping to work on more of like the upstream approaches, with those cost money, which a lot of us don't have right now. But we have put together some considerations. I'll let Travis speak to this first before we kind of get to like some action item things.
Yeah, so there's this group called PLAN, Post Landfill Action Network. And one of their presentations, they put materials into 3 categories, and they compared them to like scope, like emissions or carbon emissions, and like the 3 scopes. Again, just as like a kind of an idea, it doesn't directly apply. But the 3 scopes that they talked about is the materials that you have direct control of in your purchasing, such as electronics and furniture and office supplies, chemicals and facilities, the things that universities purchase and can really have to control and manage. And then the scope 2 is materials you purchase on campus, but really don't have any control over what it comes in. So whether it's packaging and disposable ware and food, it's like the vendor just kind of gives you what they give you, and you're left with whatever's left. And the other scope is we're open campuses. So then we also have to manage what is brought onto these campuses that we have no control over the purchasing of. So that also puts in a wrinkle in all of this. So you can go to the next one, Laura. So I look at this as like the material management stages, and we spend so much time talking about the end destination and the recycling process. But in order to get there, you can hit the next slide, Laura. In order to get there, there's a lot of things to look at. And the approach that I'm taking, again, I'm new to this position, but I've helped other companies and organizations do this work, is work your way backwards. and start with the contracts and the material acceptance guidelines, and then understand, develop a waste map, know exactly where all of your containers are located and what the signage is on them, and then think about new technology and how to actually increase your efficiency. Also look at your dumpster infrastructure, your bin infrastructure, and then also the recyclopedia part would be more on the messaging and behavioral change aspects. We often spend so much time on the messaging and behavior change stuff first, but we don't have the infrastructure in place to actually get it done correctly. So it's kind of a different way of thinking, but that's what I've been doing in the short time that I've been at UW-Madison so far. And Laura, you can go to the next one. So again, I go on campus, and these are all the different types of bins that I see. And this is probably not uncommon to any other universities. Laura, you can go to the next one. And these are photos of our dumpsters. And you can see, like, I'm looking at one cardboard dumpster that's green. I'm looking at another one that's tan. So again, and this happens because things change over time. But what I see is each of these handoffs, anytime there is a handoff, there is a opportunity for a fumble. So given that we want to make sure we increase the infrastructure so that no matter who's putting the material in, whether it's a bin and then the bin gets put into a dumpster, if the bin and the dumpster look drastically different and there's no icons, signage, color scheme, what have you, we are not helping our custodial staff out by doing that. Or if, like, hey, maybe we should include multiple languages when we do that, because our custodial staff speaks multiple languages. Again, more inclusivity, and to actually bring the custodial staff to the table to also help design these programs, and not just the sustainability team do it, but also look at everyone who's doing the work and to see how we can also figure out ways to be more efficient or faster with the process. That's what we're looking at here. So yeah, Laura, you can go to the next one. It's all you.
All right. So yeah, now we'll talk a little bit more about like action item things. And we kind of frame this in two ways, kind of like the operations-based things. This is really managed kind of by staff. Students can totally get involved with some of these, but these are some of the realizations that, like, especially we had at UWM in having to revamp our program. So in the state of Wisconsin, it is the law to recycle. We put in where that's found there. UWM did an extensive review of that and had our legal teams involved, and we worked with the DNR to work through that question, because that definitely came up in our work group was, can't we just stop recycling and then I'll solve the problem? Shut her down. Nope, it's the Wisconsin law. There's caveats in there. There's specific language as to what cannot go in the landfill. So that kind of informs this third slide over here, is if you're not really sure where to start with kind of understanding what's going in your program or how to help reduce some of your contamination, is focusing on the 4 that historically have been able to recycle over time. And this is where Travis and I, when we worked, spoke with industry professionals. They said that those were their, for the most part, 4 main important items to recycle and that have markets for continuously. We do strongly encourage, though, you work with your hauler and figure out where your hauler is taking your material. Part of the confusion with recycling, it's all regional. So some facilities accept different items. So that can also help inform your recycling programs, and also help you create clean streams. Our vendors have been really helpful in helping us understand what's in our stream currently and what they want out of that stream, which is also helping inform what our kind of revamped recycling program should even be. So it's all helping throughout the different areas. And then that helps us with this bigger image of building resilient recycling programs. Like we mentioned earlier, The markets will continue to change, especially over the next couple of years as recycling kind of figures out which way it's going to pivot itself. So some of these we'll talk about in the next slide too. I think, Travis, maybe we should just advance to that because that goes into like the bin infrastructure.
Yeah, and quickly here, I just put, here's an image of the Wisconsin landfill ban. So if you are unfamiliar with what should be collected or what is banned from the landfill, so you cannot put these materials into the trash bin. These are them, and this is done by the Wisconsin DNR. So they have plenty of resources out there too. So Laura, you can go to the next one.
But yeah, so these initiatives are where, like, I was looking at this, or we were looking at this as what can we be doing right now in the times of COVID where we don't have the resources right now to buy new, like, nice equipment for composting, or maybe not even buy new bins. But we still want to get students involved in some ways, that in a way that's safe for them to do so. So these initiatives we kind of see can be efforts that are super important to creating resilient streams or resilient programs if you don't have these pieces of information like figured out yet. But ways that students can also be involved in the process as well. You want to start with you want to take the inventory or the bin infrastructure, Travis?
Yeah, so with the taking inventory and data collection is you just really got to know what you're doing. And in the material management slide that I showed you, like that's the process that we're working on, is going backwards through it. So you got to know where everything is. And by doing that, you can then potentially change your practice. So for example, during COVID right now, a lot of the office buildings are not being serviced by our custodial staff. And I am thinking, like, I've been, I think for the last like 10 years, I've been talking about this, is like, why do we have custodial staff going into individual offices and picking up containers that all have liners in it? So it takes time, liners, resources to go out and extract those materials just to put it in a cart, when we could have centralized waste collection stations in the buildings. And that's where we're at right now because of COVID-19. So hopefully we can do some of those types of, waste saving practices, because maybe it's more important to clean our offices than it is to pick up a trash bin. And that's the same thing we're doing on the hauling side too. So the idea is the biggest savings that you're having is you want to extract that material when the bin is as full as possible. That's where your savings are going to be. You don't want to go dump air all the time from like a hauling perspective. So it's the same way from custodial perspective too. And that's how you can build resilient programs, as Laura talked about earlier. So that's kind of, I see the process is going as far as inventory, bin data collection, because that's what the data is going to inform you in the collection patterns that you see. So that goes hand in hand with bin infrastructure and signage. Infrastructure and signage just says, can I get the right material in the right place?
And that's something that UWM is working on. So we saw like the take inventory and data collection as step one. We didn't have those metrics figured out up front. We have Dan on the presentation too in the audience, who helped, along with Travis, who helped UWM really find a lot of these baselines. And because we had a couple of years of those baselines, we knew how much waste we were outputting in a year. We knew how much recycling we had. We had a pretty good idea of what was in our recycling, so contamination rates. And we also knew how much we were paying every year. And we also got on top of how often was waste management coming to our campus and servicing us. So in the future, when the market went all crazy on us, we had numbers already in place to go to leadership and say, these are our options. So this work of knowing where your dumpsters are, knowing what's in your waste, knowing how much of it is actually super important work to have if you don't already have it. But it's also, if you don't have somebody working on this in your office, and I know everybody's stretched pretty thin when and don't have a lot of time to focus specifically on this. It is something that if students are interested in getting involved with, that's something they can help you on. They can go out if there's in-person classes and mark down where the dumpster is, and things like that. And then something that our goal is in times of COVID with bin infrastructure and signage, as Travis showed earlier, signage is kind of like all over or just non-existent. So that's this year we're really focusing on what materials do we want to focus on advertising to the campus community. Let's stop. I always use the ketchup cup as the example, you know, like the condiment round ketchup cup technically could be recycled, but our vendors are like, we don't want that. So let's not waste our time telling students to clean it out and recycle it if our vendors don't want it. So that's where kind of coming back to the basics of like, let's really make sure that our campus community knows they can recycle cans, water bottles, laundry jugs, and things like that. And then this is where we can kind of like open up the discussion about what some of the things that your campuses are working on. I know a lot of the discussion is moving towards the upstream approach. And I know on our like lunch call yesterday, we were starting to really talk about procurement. Something I do want to call out though is there's a lot of ban action going on around policy. And something that I learned recently was maybe don't frame it as a ban, but like phrase it, it's a phase out. You're not stopping a program right now today. That's kind of what a ban makes it feel like. Yesterday I could do it, but today I can't. Whereas a phase out gives everybody time to readjust. And for like UWM, it's like we don't have cutlery out, plastic cutlery right now because it's can't put your hand in there and things like that. So it's like right now might be a good time to make those considerations. And work with your purchasing department. Sometimes you're with these bigger things, they're usually tied to a larger contract. Your restaurant operations could have a 5-year contract with a vendor, and it specifically calls out they must provide us with this item, and the vendor might not be able to backpedal on that. So that's a good time to reach out to your purchasing team and see when some of these food contracts expire. Yes. So
I think that's a perfect time to open it up for Q&A now too. So I guess, yeah, Laura, do you want to open it up to the audience and say, does anyone have any questions or comments on the presentation so far? Or even if there's something that you're doing on your campus that you want the rest of the group to know about?
Yeah. So that's where, I'm interested in like if any of your campuses have been impacted by this. I know some have been, like we've talked about your contracts coming up. And I know we've worked with some of you on that. So I'm wondering have you been hearing about recycling guidelines changing on your campus? Have your vendors been reaching out and rejecting things of yours? Or your general thoughts too?
I do want to take J.O.'s question that says there are people of diverse abilities that have specific needs for certain products that are getting the ban or particular. So do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, hi, it's Jackie. And I was speaking from a perspective of people with diverse abilities. I attended, for example, the Disabilities Rights Commission in Madison, and they were talking about the plastic straw ban that was trying to get passed, like a policy in the city of Madison. And a lot of people with diverse abilities and their loved ones spoke out at this like community meeting to say that they really, they have physical needs for maybe a plastic straw if they want to drink their beverage in this community, and that like the burden is then placed on them to either like acquire that or bring that with them, and just doesn't make Madison feel like as welcoming and of a community that is for everyone. So I just wanted to mention that. I know we all are sick of plastic and recycling, and so there's like the one that comes to the top of my head is like the plastic straw ban or phase out, and how some of those certain items kind of get a lot of attention and we're over here like, we're not sure how much that actually does. And then there are some people that, that do have the need for it. So I just want to mention that.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and that's something that doesn't get voiced right out the gate, but those are definitely always part of the consideration plans. There's always going to be exemptions you need to follow as well. That's something like when Travis was talking about the all in the hall, suspend desk side service in the offices and have these centralized collection points. Our campus actually looked into that, and we reached out to our accessibility center to understand where students on campus where that wouldn't be an ideal situation for them. Also understanding where staff are, where that might be an issue as well, so that we can work with the custodians in those buildings and let them know how their operations were going to be a little bit different than the rest of the campus, to make sure we're accommodating everybody and making sure that people didn't feel left out in this process. So definitely a huge point. It should always kind of be in your checklist of who might this program impact in different ways.
That's fantastic to hear that that you made those considerations with your program to make it accessible to everyone on your campus.
Yeah, it's great that people make it known too, because they're definitely not, there's so many things to think about. So it's point on the checklist to definitely have.
Does anyone else have any other questions or ideas or comments on the programs that you're working on?
I got a question about what's the best way to get into the procurement and contract conversation? Because I have made these attempts in the past without success. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight about how you sort of get through to the people making those decisions or working with that contract, that like this is worth their time and they need to consider it.
Join the waste recycling group. Just kidding. No, I mean, Travis can maybe speak a little bit more, but I know that's like kind of like long-term goal that we've been having with like our procurement team, especially with incorporating surplus into that discussion too. So like we have buy-in from restaurant operations to do things like the phase out the single-use to-go containers and get those like Aussie systems on our campus. But that's obviously something that we need to work with procurement on. And Josh just put in the chat, I've heard purchasing offices will be more centralized through UW system services after January due to budgets. In a way that might be good for all of us. Because I know,
or bad.
Or bad, I know.
You know, like this is part of the issue.
Yeah, and I wish Andrew was on this call from UWM from Surplus, because he has really dug into a lot of that procurement stuff and seen where the gaps are. So it's like some things in the UW system are like very standard across the board. But when you look in, as I understand, just hearing like through Second Story, is that like procurement is wildly different at all universities, and some things that can happen at Point cannot happen at Milwaukee. So I know that's kind of like a goal for me this year, is to really dig into these procurement questions and figure out where to go next.
Dave, can I just share a little, I don't know who's keeping you out of those conversations. That would be baffling. But when I started, when we worked on our first waste contract, we have 3 different facilities. There's housing, the student union, and academic buildings. And they had never sat in a room together to work on the same contract until I showed up and thought that that was a good idea. So, shocking. And it just kind of started from there. But I've had a good relationship with purchasing ever since I started. I developed that very early on. So I guess that's what led to us being involved as we kept making changes through the years.
I have just something to add. Being someone who like works in surplus pretty regularly and like working with our purchasing, what I found, and it's just kind of like a cyclical kind of issue just with government budgets as a whole, is there's no incentive to save like any budget. Like unless you're like a revenue generating account, your budget expires at the end of the year. So there's no real incentive for these offices to not spend their budget, because if they don't spend their budget, then they actually lose their budget, or their budget will get cut next year because it's been determined that they don't need as much. So what I'm actually finding working with surplus is, although we're reducing the amount of things manufactured by selling, and then in theory, people are purchasing used, so not buying as much new, we're still always buying new. Like the campus is just selling its old stuff to other people for less. So we're essentially like racing to the bottom. So I think that that's just something important to note. Essentially, our funding structures for governments are not incentivizing saving at the end of it.
You know, we rolled out an entire ROI that was, and our strategies were put together by a stakeholder group. Laura didn't go into all the details, but you know, we were faced with a $265,000 contamination fee, and I'll tell you, people were interested in what we were going to do to avoid that, and we had to completely overhaul the system. But we're saving $150,000 a year by implementing our own internalized system, and that's with adding 2 staff. So I get your point, Josh, I really do. But I think if you sit down and have, you do the work and you run the numbers and show people, I mean, we did that change. We got that approval within 3 to 4 months, and then worked to hire the staff and change the system. So I think that's what sustainability offices need to develop a skill set for, is putting together some ROI. And this contamination fee was almost, I'm going to say it's a blessing, because it gave us that really big number to go up against to create a better system. And a lot of what Laura does is justified through a return on investment from contract savings. I could go on, but essentially this position was created out of an ROI. And then she went on to do an even bigger overhaul that was an ROI. So it's sad to think that the state doesn't want to see savings, but they do like to see the numbers. At least in Milwaukee, I know they do.
No, that was really good. Laura, are you speaking?
I muted myself because I was like, anyways, go ahead.
I just wanted to give, there was a chat here, Joe Lieberforth, did you want to speak about the program you're working on?
Yeah, I would love to speak about it. So I'm a freshman at UW-Madison. In my first week on campus, I noticed that the UW bookstore was using plastic bags. And I was like, that's a little interesting. Like, why are they offering me a plastic bag? I'm just buying some like 2 folders. I have my backpack on. Like, why are they offering that? That doesn't make too much sense to me. So I did some research. I ended up finding out that there's an assembly bill and a Senate bill in Wisconsin that doesn't allow cities to ban the use of plastic bags or any single-use plastics, which is super interesting. And I think that's one of the reasons that Madison actually did plastic straws, because that was one way that they were able to reduce plastics directly, because all auxiliary like containers weren't able to be banned. But anyways, back to my project. I did some research and got in contact with the Green Fund at UW-Madison, and we're targeting what's the best way that we can reduce our plastic bags in the bookstores. And we were able to, with the help of Natalie, who's just another student on campus, she helped the bookstore get to paper bags, but paper bags isn't quite the solution that we want, because although it's not plastic, there's still a process like what you were talking about earlier in manufacturing those. And it turns out that in some ways, the creation of plastic or of paper bags is actually more expensive. Although it's better on the back end with pollution and recycling and decomposing of the products, on the front end, it's actually more expensive and takes more energy. And so we want to get to a more sustainable, long-lasting product for the bookstore. One of the biggest problems there is the plastic bags were their biggest advertising. And so seeing the red bags around campus was kind of their main way for students to be drawn in. And students only tend to go there once or twice a year to get their textbooks. And so other than that, there's no incentive for people to come into the store. And so to kind of fix that problem in a different light, we're working on getting canvas bags that would cost more on the front end, but also would allow us to have incentives for people to come into the bookstore. And so we're working on a program that basically allows students to use their UW bookstore canvas bags and receive like a percentage back on their purchases there. And so we're working on programs. We have one planned for Earth Day where students can design bags, and then if they bring that in, they can get additional percentages off. And then another program on top of that that we're working on is similar to Penn State in the way of using tokens. And so they have a program in which if you save a plastic bag, you're given a token, and you can kind of put that into a receptacle that kind of each token represents like 5 cents. And so whatever receptacle you put it into will be then donated to whatever company or organization that supports. So we're looking on supporting 3 organizations and having a program where students can pick which organization they want to support. So that's what I've been working on over the past couple of months.
That's awesome to hear, Joe. Thank you for that. Joe just gave us a packaging problem 101 session just there. That was really good.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to purchasing. So we can't directly ban plastic bags in Madison, although that would be great, but we can change what resources we're actually purchasing. So we can buy canvas bags instead of buying paper or plastic, which is one of the ways that you guys explained earlier.
Yeah, so Joe, if you want, put your information in the chat if you're willing to, if there's any other students around the other UW system that want to connect with Joe directly,